So I guess two things which will actually become abundantly clear as I present. This is, in some sense, on the limits of the concept of affective economy, which is related to libidinal economy. And secondly, which this is more explicitly, although the name's been invoked several times, more explicitly on a Spinozist Marxism than a Freudian or Lacanian Marxism. So we can discuss those things, hopefully, as well. Spinoza's question of political thought, why do the masses fight for their servitude as if it was salvation, has taken on a particular valence since the post-2008 economic recession. Displaced from its 17th century context of taxes and bread, wars of glory, and despots, it is possible to see the struggle for servitude in the way in which the masses clamor for more jobs, more austerity, and more persecution of the disadvantaged in the name of fiscal responsibility and discipline. The blog Splintering Bone Ashes has dubbed this particular struggle for servitude negative solidarity. Negative solidarity is defined as an aggressively enraged sense of injustice committed to the idea that because I must endure increasingly austere working conditions, wage freezes, loss of benefits, declining pension, erasure of job security, and increasing precarity, that everyone else must too. We can point to multiple instances of negative solidarity, and with them, a changing trajectory of both imagination and affect. There is the, of course, iconic figure of the welfare queen, and with it, the racialized demonization of benefit programs for the unemployed and impoverished. There's also the figure of the migrant, also chastised for dependency and laziness on the one hand, and sometimes seen as stealing jobs on the other. More recently, negative solidarity has been aimed at the public service worker, the teacher or government employee, who still benefits, albeit ever so slightly, from union protection, collective bargaining, and thus is seen as failing to suffer or to work adequately. That negative solidarity can take on so many different figures, many of which are pure fantasies, suggests that it is at its core an articulation of imagination and affect. Grounding and elaborating a definition of negative solidarity entails a necessary detour through the affective economy. The affective economy, as I'm going to propose it here, is understood in two senses. First, that the economy, the relations of production and distribution, circulate and produce affects, sensibilities, and desires as much as they do goods and services. And second, these affects are a necessary element, necessary condition of the production and reproduction of economic life. So part one, elaborating on that, affective economy, a definition. According to Deleuze and Guattari, Spinoza did not just pose the question of negative solidarity, of why people fight for their servitude as if it was salvation, but offered the basis of an answer to it as well, in order to grasp how, as Deleuze and Guattari put it, desire of the most disadvantaged creature will invest with all of its strength, irrespective of any economic understanding or lack of it, the capitalist social field as a whole, end quote. It is necessary to think the immanence of desire to the economic. Or as Deleuze and Guattari put it, desire must be thought as part of the infrastructure, without passing through the mediations of ideology, the family, or the state. Deleuze and Guattari's provocation exceeds their own particular articulation, anti-Oedipus, to become a general problem, I would argue, of post-68 thought. There's a general turn towards understanding subjectivity to be not only directly produced by the economy without passing through the mediations of the superstructure, but reproductive of it as well, to be a necessary condition of the reproduction of society. This insight is found not only in Deleuze and Guattari's work, but in Althusser's re-examination of ideology and reproduction, as well as the work of neo-Spinozas such as Frédéric Laudon and Yves Sitton. The causes of this change, no doubt complex and numerous, have as much to do with the changing nature of capitalism itself as they do with the history of worker and student struggle. As capital requires work that is more intensive, cooperative, and relational, and needs a subject that is not just docile and compliant, showing up for work each day, but actively desires to be put to work and identifies with his or her work. Spinoza's identity of bodies and ideas makes it possible to grasp an economy that is increasingly predicated on the identity of economy, on this identity of subjectivity in the economy. How does Spinoza, a philosopher from the 17th century, make it possible to grasp this rather recent transformation? First, there is Spinoza's definition of subjectivity, of the human essence as defined by desire. As Spinoza writes, Desire is the very essence of man, insofar as his essence is conceived as determined to any action from a given affection of itself. As much as Spinoza's definition posits a universal essence, it does so in a way that is both singular, we all have different desires depending on our particular constitution, and relational in that our constitutions are the effects of our individual encounters in history. Put differently, desire is trans-individual. As Spinoza argues, we do not desire something because it is good. There is no telos for desire. Rather, quote, we judge something to be good because we strive for it, will it, want it, and desire it, end quote. Desire is fundamentally intransitive, lacking a specific telos, object or orientation. Its objects and orientations are defined by the history of our relations. Everyone strives to increase their joy, their capacity to act and think, but how this joy is defined is in part determined by the history of past encounters. I desire those things that seem to me to be the cause of past joys, even if I'm ignorant of the true causes. Everyone strives, which is not to say that all striving is equal. The Kanata striving is always caught between two determinations. There is a past history of encounters that assigns an individual specific objects and desires without often adequately grasping their relations, and the possibility of a life oriented from an adequate comprehension of its conditions and an increase of its powers and capacities. It is this ethical division between the passive and active life that animates Spinoza's thought. It is, as André Tossel argues, an ethical materialism, a materialism oriented in terms of the division and difference of modes of individuation, considered primarily in terms of their individual biographical relations, that takes as its terrain of inquiry affects, desire, and the imagination as constitutive of subjectivity. Frederick Laudon argues that the Spinoza mode of subjection can be expanded beyond the ethical distinction of modes of life to the history and reproduction of subjectivity under capitalism. Doing so entails expanding the encounters that shapes one's desires from the biographical to the historical and structural. Spinoza provides something of an opening of this transition from the ethical to the social when he writes, in a somewhat offhand manner, that money occupies the mind of the multitude more than anything else. Money is the universal equivalent of desire, not just because of past positive experiences in one's own biography, but an institutional one, because we live in a market society in which money is the condition of any desire. Laudon is then able to map the coordinates of the institutionalization of desire onto two axes. The first is considered in terms of the division between production and consumption, the two separate spheres of activity in capitalist society. Production and consumption relate to the two structural conditions of capitalism, wage labor and the commodity form, but they also form the basis of different organizations of desire, of joy, and sadness. The second axis, which brings us to the second axis, drawn from Spinoza, joy and sadness understood as an increase or decrease of one's power and potential. From these two coordinates, these two axes, it's possible to coordinate a history of desire under capitalism. The first phase of this history corresponds to the initial formation of capitalism, what Marx called formal subsumption. The primary institutional basis for capital at this stage is the absence of any alternative to wage labor, the destruction of the commons, or any sustenance economy. Activity, the necessary activity that sustains life, is organized and oriented in and through wage labor. The passion to be reckoned with at this stage of capital is fear, to paraphrase Hobbes, who captured better than Spinoza the affective composition of this early stage of primitive accumulation. Fear, of course, is the idea of any future hardship, or as Spinoza would put it, sadness. Fear is a motive, a driving force, orienting the striving, the conatus, but an unstable one. People compelled by fear will work, but only as much as necessary to stave off the punishment they fear. Those who do not work do not eat, and it's fear, starvation, or homelessness that keeps one working. Fear is not only a limited incentive, it is a fundamentally unstable one. Fear can drive one to revolt as much as it can compel one to obey. From this, then, Laudon maps a second stage that roughly corresponds with Fordism and the rise of consumer society. For Laudon, the institutional effect of Fordism is one of the destruction of the pleasures and pride of concrete labor, the pleasures of a particular skill, in favor of a general shift of desire away from labor towards consumption. Ford's $5 day establishes an effective economy exchanging sadness and frustration at work for the pleasure of the newly emergent consumer society. And then the final or most recent stage that Laudon maps out in this affective economy reorients pleasure, reorients desire towards work, but is no longer the pleasure of a particular skill or result, but is the pleasure of employment itself. It is a desire that is as much as possible modeled on abstract labor. The modern subject of capitalism is described in terms that are stripped of reference to any particular task or activity, and instead refer to employability as a general ideal. The modern individual is a professional entrepreneur of him or herself. Foremost assumption, Fordism, neoliberalism constitute the rough schema of the history of the conatus of desire under capitalism. It is a history that moves from the negative affects to joyful, from fear to joy, from consumption to production. A transition that is less a liberation of becoming active than a subjection. It culminates in the modern ideal to find one's realization, one's passion, in the structure and activity of work itself. The new mantra is to do what you love and you'll never have to work a day in your life, as often quoted by Silicon Valley gurus. But in practice, this is less about the real revalorization of a trade or pleasures of specific labor than finding passion for the constant mobilization of one's potential. It is a history in which the gap between the capitalist interest and the striving of the worker shrinks to become barely perceptible, a world of motivated self-starters. Part 2, negative solidarity. With the provisional structure of affective economy outlined here, it is possible then to try and map out a later stage, something that comes after the affective economy of neoliberal motivation. Working in two very different areas of research, Jennifer Silva and David Graeber have mapped out some directions of the affective economy and what could be considered late or declining neoliberalism. Jennifer Silva sets out to examine precisely what happens to lives in the US caught in the post-2008 recession. These are the lives of primarily working class people caught up in debt, with dwindling job prospects and often forced to live with their parents well past the age that that's considered desirable or acceptable. They've been denied the promised life of careers, families, and homes of their own, in some sense mourning the slow decline of the Fordist dream. What Silva finds striking is a lack of any anger or political mobilization on the part of those who are left out of this version of the American dream. Being let out of the dream of the steady and linear career does not entirely exclude one from the mythology, from the ideal of work and discipline. As she describes her general findings, quote, "At its core, the emerging working class adult self is characterized by low expectations of work, wariness towards romantic commitment, widespread of social institutions, profound isolation from others, and an overriding focus on their emotions and psychic health. Rather than turn to politics to address the obstacles standing in the way of a secure adult life, the majority of men and women I interviewed crafted deeply personal coming-of-age stories grounding their adult identities in recovering from their painful pasts, whether addiction, child abuse, family trauma, or abandonment, and forging an emancipated, transformed, and adult self." End quote. To describe this shift along the lines outlined by Lourdon, we can see a new affective orientation, one sustained neither by consumption, which has been too reduced to basic necessities to capture desire, or even production, as work becomes stripped not only of any joys, but any fantasy of mobility. In its place, there's an ideal of work as discipline. Self-transformation becomes a source of validation. Personal worth, personal validation is found not through what one can buy, or even what one can sell of oneself, but in the sense of self-transformation or responsibility for one's own condition. It is a responsibility that matters, not the results or outcome. And she often cites these people who will have gone through these horrible, they lost this job, lost that job, and they constantly insist that they are responsible. They're not going to blame anything or anyone else. Pride in taking responsibility, one's fate, is an attempt to construct joy, a positive condition, out of a negative and sad affect. It is an attempt to make the difficulty or changing one's condition into itself an activity. Spinoza argues the mind has a tendency to dwell on things that increase its joy and power. Lourdon argues that the effect of this is less some innate tendency towards affirmation or liberation than an explanation of how people can put up with the most limited possibilities for joy and power. It is less a line of flight than what keeps us confined in whatever situation we find ourselves in. The tendency to affirm joy leads individuals to dwell on those tiny pleasures of the workday, the small talk and casual Fridays, or in this case, the satisfaction and sense of responsibility that stems from relying only on oneself. As the possibility for aspiring for more, for systemic change is increasingly reduced, the tiny pleasures of daily life are elevated into objects of desire. As Laurent describes this double-edged moment, quote, symbolic violence consists, then properly speaking, in the production of a double imaginary. The imaginary fulfillment, which makes the humble joys assigned to the dominated appear sufficient, and the imaginary of powerlessness, which convinces them to renounce any greater ones to which they might aspire. In the closing section of Bullshit Jobs, which is actually more interesting than the beginning stuff on bullshit jobs, David Graeber offers his own answer to Spinoza's question, why do the workers fight for their servitude as if it was salvation? Or in his terms, why do we put up with and actively encourage the rise of pointless and demeaning jobs? As Graeber writes, answering his own question, quote, workers, in other words, gain feelings of dignity and self-worth because they hate their jobs, end quote. Graeber's formulation inverts the classic definition of alienation, in which negative affects, loss of sense, self, purpose, and activity lead to a critical or negative relation to work. Rather, it is because one finds work to be painful, demeaning, and or difficult that one is attached to it, finds its justification. The difficulty of work becomes, in part, an attachment to that difficulty as a marker of responsibility and worth. As Graeber argues, this can be seen in the hostility people have to those who have those who they imagine to have some sense of purpose and pleasure in their jobs. As in the case of the anger directed at striking teachers in the US, who are expected often to have forgone their higher pay for the opportunity to do something that is rewarding. To love one's job, or even to be thought to, imagined to love one's job by others, is seen as to be not really working. The pride that one takes in one's work is inseparable from the anger and jealousy that one has towards others, towards what imagines as their imagined life of pleasure or ease. The sketch of a post-neoliberal subject is a highly ambivalent one. Its ambivalence stems from the ambivalence of the affects themselves, their tendency to be shadowed by their opposite, the fear that follows hope, and vacillate between the two. In this case, joys and pleasures are not only inseparable from pains and tribulations, but a kind of transformation or revalorization of them. It also reveals the connection between striving and the imagination. As Spinoza writes, quote, both insofar as the mind has clear and distinct ideas, and insofar it has confused ideas, it strives for an indefinite duration to preserve in its being and is conscious of the striving it has, end quote. Which is to say that all acting, all thinking is strategic, as Laurent Bove argues, motivated by an attempt to affirm and maximize one's power. As Spinoza writes, the mind is, as far as it can, strives to imagine those things that increase or aid the body's power of acting. We all equally strive, but all striving is not equal. Spinoza stresses the mind that strives to imagine. Suggesting the mind does not always grasp the conditions of its liberation. Just as striving orients the imagination, compelling us to imagine those things that aid our capacity to action, the imagination conditions and limits striving, determining our sense of what is possible or desirable. Sometimes what we imagine to be the condition of an increase of power is actually our subjection. Desire and imagination, body and mind, are subject to the same causal relations, the same conditions that make up history. The attachments to responsibility, to a sense of worth found in work, are strategies for coping for declining prospects for improved material conditions. They are remnants, often images of bygone working conditions and decaying dreams. What we increasingly see in austerity is a revival of the oldest myths and legends of capital and capitalist accumulation against its material reality. It is a revival of primitive accumulation, not in the sense of the violence of expropriation against the commons, but in the sense of the narrative of so-called primitive accumulation, the story of the frugal capitalist and lazy worker that provides a moral veneer to the capitalist relation. As Marx writes, and this passage is pretty familiar, I think, to a lot of people, this primitive accumulation plays approximately the same role in political economy as original sin does in theology. Adam bit the apple, and thereupon sin fell upon the human race. Its origin is supposed to be explained when it's told as an anecdote about the past. Long, long ago, there were two sorts of people. One, the diligent and intelligent and above all frugal elite. The other, lazy rascals spending their substance and more in riotous living. The legend of the theological original sin tells us certainly how man came to be condemned to eat his bread by the sweat of his brow, but the history of economic original sin reveals to us that there are people to whom this is by no means essential. Never mind, thus it came to pass that the former sort accumulated wealth, and the latter sort finally had nothing to sell except their skins, end quote. Permanent accumulation persists not as a myth about the origins of capital, but as a lingering morality play about the present. Work, especially work that is understood as real, which is to say is coded as productivist, masculine, and often white, is understood to be the source of at least symbolic value, even as its market value declines. As the Bible says, those who do not work should not eat. In this case, not because their work is necessary for survival in a direct sense, but because it's necessary to make them worthy. Moreover, all those who are not sufficiently engaged in this productivist ideal, teachers, caregivers, bureaucrats, are seen as not really working, or to use the parlance of our time, they do not have real jobs. They are suspect as well. The narrative at the heart of permanent accumulation was always defined by a temporal displacement. It was an idealized version of the present, the hard worker who saves enough to become a capitalist, projected onto the past, onto capital's origins. Now it is temporally disrupted once again, and that is projected towards the future as the moral ideal of frugality and discipline lasts long after their material rewards. The story about the moral value of work is all that remains as work is increasingly subject to the logics of casualization and precarity. It is at this point that Spinoza's understanding of the constitution of ideas, of the mind as a spiritual automaton, that is just as, if not more important in grasping the contemporary sense of work than his understanding of the organization of desire. It is as much a matter of inadequate ideas as it is the reorganization of desire. As Spinoza argues in part 2 of the Ethics, so-called universal ideas such as man, dog, etc., stem more from a confusion than a comprehension. They are inadequate ideas unable to grasp or comprehend their genesis. As Spinoza describes this process, quote, "But it should not be noted these notions are not formed by all in the same way, but vary from one to another, in accordance with what body has been more often been affected by and what the mind imagines or recollects more easily. For example, those who have more often regarded man's stature with wonder will understand by the word man an animal of erect stature. But those who have been accustomed to consider something else will form another common image of man. For example, that man is an animal capable of laughter, or a featherless biped, or a rational animal. And similarly concerning the others, each will form universal images of things according to the disposition of his body. Hence, it is not surprising that so many controversies have arisen among the philosophers who have often wished to explain natural things by mere image of things." End quote. And thus, we could say that work, too, or labor, is said in many senses. There's a general physical notion of energy expended in displacement and transformation, the economic sense of activity, any activity done for a wage, and the more diffuse sense in which any activity defined by difficulty is dubbed work, at least in English, homework, housework, etc. And lastly, there is the moral idea of discipline and value that is attached to its last two meanings. These different senses do not only, as the passage from Spinoza indicates, stem from different encounters and relations in which everyone would have their own personal and idiosyncratic definition, but there is in every society an attempt to impose and standardize one particular definition, imposing its particular sense over all the others. There's a dominant sensibility of work as much as there's a dominant affective constitution. The dominant sense is a motley collection of everything that's ever been believed, made up of remnants of Puritan struggle, Fordist promises, and contemporary anxiety. Its anachronisms are tailored to the current conjuncture in which more is demanded of employees and less is given in exchange. Last section, affective economy, mythic economy. From this provisional sketch of the present, we can grasp, in a negative solidarity in the present, we can grasp two interlinking limitations to Laudon's periodization of the organization of desire under capitalism. First, Laudon's three periods make the fundamental error of any any periodization of history really, presenting history as a succession and transformation of self-contained epochs. Workers driven by the fear of losing their wages were not totally displaced by Fordist dreams of consumption, just as working to consume has not been displaced by the neoliberal fantasy of being an entrepreneur driven by one's own passionate investment in their work. These different organizations of desire coexist not just in the same world, distributed across a global economy that combines sweatshops, modern factories, and technological entrepreneurs, often within the same company or producing the same commodity, but the same city, and if we consider them primarily in terms of their affective dimension, in the same individual. So, we may, over the course of our day, may be driven to work because we're fearful of losing our job, think about something we might want to buy, and sometimes even think of it as some kind of bizarre realization of ourself. Laudon's emphasis on a particular affect and a particular affective orientation, love or fear, aimed towards the activity or the wage, risks overlooking one of Spinoza's central insights about affects, the ambivalence of affects. Spinoza argues the human body is composed of a great many individuals of different natures, and when it comes to the object of desire, one and the same object can be the cause of many and contrary affects. This complexity gives us rise to their vacillation. Sometimes, and then, as I said, in terms of thinking this in terms of what Laudon says, sometimes one works just to pay the bills, other times one's motivated by the possibilities of consumption, and sometimes one is roped into believing that it's a realization of what they're capable of doing. This brings us to the second limitation of Laudon's analysis, is in failing to see the heterogeneity of the present, that Laudon fails to recognize that any unity of the present moment, its ability to hold together in the image of a capitalist society, consumer society, or neoliberal gig economy is as much an effect of the assemblage and organization of ideas and the imagination as it is the organization of affects and the strivings of bodies. There's a dominant idea or image of work, of its reality, value, and effects that organizes the disparate experiences and conditions of work, or more to the point, desires are structured as much by myth and ideals as they are by their material conditions. Our desires, our conatus, is oriented as much by our imaginations as the structural conditions that structure work and consumption. As Yves Sedon argues, our imagination is scripted and oriented in and through the scripts of the culture industry. What Sedon stresses is less a literal indoctrination in which culture industry directly disseminates ideology than a metalepsis through which the basic orientation is communicated. Work, especially as is understood to be an individual discipline and competition, is the point where the myths of the media and our lives intersect. The labor relation cannot be separated from the narratives that we use to make sense of it and orient ourselves, from the Horatio Alger myths of days gone by to modern-day Silicon Valley gurus that extol us to find our passion and our calling. Marx, of course, defined ideology as the ruling ideas of the ruling class, a definition that posed a problem as much as it defined the term. The problem is quite simply, if consciousness is determined by life, a basic tenet of materialism, then how is the life of the working class ever going to be under the sway of the ruling class? The answer to this question is not to be found in the complexity of ideology, but its immediacy and spontaneity. In other words, in the ideology of work itself. Work labor is a short circuit between the classes, not just because it's the linchpin of the relation of exploitation, is what the ruling class needs from the working class, and is what the worker must necessarily sell to the capitalist. This relation is much a non-relation as it is a relation. What the capitalist treats as just another commodity and cost of production is for the worker their very life and existence, at least at the level of material conditions. As much as the point of the division between the two classes, its representation is the point of their articulation and suture. The modern capitalist increasingly presents himself or herself as a worker. One insists that he or she works as much as their workers, if not more so. As Etienne Balibar writes, quote, "The capitalist is defined as a worker, as an entrepreneur, the worker as the bearer of a capacity of human capital," end quote. Work increasingly appears as the founding principle rather than the excluded exception to capital. Thus, to offer something of conclusion, every affective composition, every organization of desire, joys, and sadness is also an imaginary composition, an organization of ideas and images. They are but two different ways of viewing the same thing. Any attempt to grasp the economy or society solely through the affects of the imagination is necessarily incomplete. However, when it comes to political practice, there are strategic reasons for favoring the imagination or the affects or for confronting the image and the affective composition of work. Negative solidarity, like every affective composition, is an articulation of both desire and imagination, and like all such articulations, and is finite and capable of being unraveled. There's nothing necessary about the connection between a moralizing idea of work and pride in one's hardship, as intractable as they may appear. Understanding the mythic, affective and mythic dimensions of the reproduction of the present is the first step in beginning to transform it. Thank you.